Hi, everyone. Welcome to an episode of Parent Like a Professional. I am Monica Yanokita, and I am here with Dr. Eric Meyer and Marquis Helms, and we are going to be talking about different phases of parenting. So we talk a lot about kids and their different developmental phases, but we forget sometimes to talk about what we as parents are going through and also what our responsibilities are as our kids move through these different phases. So I was doing a little bit of research and just thinking there's not a lot about this out there on the internet, and I think that we've had a lot of discussions as to what the different phases are. So wanted to jump in and start talking about that. All right, so we have 5 different phases that we have talked about and come up with in terms of our for parenting. The first one was teaching, directing, coaching, and advising, and being a friend. So we're going to jump into the first one today and start talking about the teaching phase. And usually that's typically anywhere from age 0 to 10, although age isn't as much of a determining factor of what phase you are in. It is more about what the child's needs are. All right, so one of the reasons why we really want to talk about these different phases, or why we feel like it's important, is because these phases will help give us a frame and a better understanding and a focus and a direction to assist our kids and our young adults as they go through these different phases. And I kind of think of these as changing seasons where there's no clear end or beginning to any of these phases. It's kind of like a gradual shift where sometimes you're in multiple phases at one time. So the first phase that we've talked about is teaching. So what are some of the different child's needs, do you think, in the teaching phase, which is going to be like your 0 to 9, 10 years old?
For their needs, right? So at that point at the teaching phase, I would think that we're trying to teach them the new skills necessary to navigate the world that they're in. So initially, like you have a newborn, right? They can't really do much. They cry when they're hungry. They cry when they're thirsty. They cry when they're tired. They cry when they want comfort. And so that's their way of communicating. But over time, as time passes, they're starting to establish eye contact a little more. They're starting to, reach out for things. They're touching things. They're on their belly, strengthening, the strength of their neck. Eventually, they start to crawl, and we provide a lot of reinforcement, social praise, everything that we would need to provide to, if you want to say, encourage the child to move forward. They start to make sounds. We reinforce those sounds. We model those sounds. So we're there as a parent, guiding them and providing those reinforcers so that we can strengthen those behaviors that are emerging, those skill sets that are emerging. So what is our responsibility, Monica, that you were asking? I would say it's to provide and model throughout the time that our children are learning new skills. And again, it's all the way from crawling, to having social interactions with their peers. And so it's like a wide range. I love the analogy of, it's like changing seasons. It's not like from 0 to 3 and then we're in a different phase. I mean, teaching new skills, it's happening all the way through the time that they're at least 9 years of age, right? Where they acquire most of the skills that are necessary to navigate the world. But then, once we teach them these skills, or at least reinforce the skills that are that they're acquiring, then we start to look at, the next phase. But I believe, and I'd love to hear more from Marquis, that, our role is of a teacher when we're in the teaching phase. Yeah.
Yeah, this role is very important. And I love this phase because, as a parent, and it's nobody's fault, right? Because it's busy, especially if you have more than one kid, it's very easy to get in the mindset of it's just going to be easier if I do it myself. Or we just got to get there on time. I'm tying the shoes. I'm putting on the pants. I'm brushing their teeth. And there's a lot of emphasis in this teaching phase because if you really take the time to teach them, you don't have to do those things in the future. And so we encourage you to have patience, and we encourage you to spend a lot of time in this phase for skills that it would just be easier for you to do them yourself because it's going to benefit them a lot in the long run and make your job easier in the long run.
That's true.
Like we say, work hard now and life will be easier later, right?
Yeah,
Teach your
Totally.
children the skills, take the time. And sometimes more in this teaching phase, we're in a hurry to go somewhere. And so it's like, oh, I don't have time to teach my son or daughter how to tie their shoes. Well, maybe that's not the time to work on it. Maybe, we take a different time where, we're relaxed, they're relaxed. It's a nice, easy environment. And we work on tying shoes, not when we have to go somewhere, but just to work on the skill itself. And spend small amounts of time when you're teaching these skills. And especially when you're teaching new skills with young children, do it in the form of play. I mean, that's how most people, most children learn new skills. It's through navigating the world through play. So there's no better way to teach a new skill if you're having fun, they're having fun, and it's through play.
And I think one of the really important parts too is breaking down, like most of the things you're going to be teaching are pretty complex, and have multiple steps. So breaking it down and the expectation being kind of small, I think that's one of our big responsibilities as parents during this phase, is to break down these steps and make them more manageable, and then reinforce as they're more successful and keep building on them. So, that's important, to break down the steps, because they can't learn this huge multiple step skill if they haven't learned the first little part of it. So, something
Yeah,
to
so we call
really
that,
be.
like in our field, and the field of psychology, specifically in behavior analysis, we call that a task analysis. So what are all the steps, so that you have like your step-by-step curriculum to teach something that's a new skill. What are all the steps? And then, what steps are we teaching today? And what are we going to do for the child? So we might teach the first step and model it, and provide hand over hand prompts. And then eventually we start to fade those prompts, and then we finish steps 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 for the child, so that it's not such a trying task. Maybe the next day when you work on it, your son or daughter can do step 1, and you start working on step 1 where you just provide reinforcers and praise, and then you get to step 2 and you provide some prompts, hand over hand prompts or verbal prompts. And then eventually they're able to do step 1 and 2 together, and you make a big deal, and you go so on and so forth until you get through all the steps, and then they can do the skill on their own.
A really good example for this in my current situation is I have a fourth grader, a second grader, and a first grader. And my fourth grader, like, expectations in the morning for the morning routine, was that for the fourth grader, she's really great. She does everything. She gets dressed, she brushes her teeth, she comes downstairs, she makes her own breakfast, she helps prepare lunches for all the kids, and she does her hair. She does everything is done. I don't have to tell her to do anything, more or less. And my first grader, and granted she is third child, but all she really, her expectation is just to get dressed and get downstairs. And she gets her breakfast started, but I really do help her with the rest. And so my son and daughter, the older ones, are like, why doesn't she have to get all of her stuff? Why are you putting all of her things in? I was like, this is where she's at right now. So she gets reinforced for making it downstairs and starting her breakfast. But I give the verbal reminders of the shoes and socks and the other things right now, but I'm like, she's not as old as you guys. The expectation will increase, but it's kind of just a really, clear to, like, that you can see, like, where one is and where the other one is for the same exact, morning routine. So
That's
Right.
fun.
yeah.
Um, Stephanie's not with us today, but we've talked about this subject before, and she had something really important to say about this teaching phase too. Like, there is often the perspective of, like, my child can't do it, like, what are they doing wrong? But we're asking you to kind of take on the perspective of a parent of, okay, if they didn't do it right, how did I teach it, and what do I need to do differently as a parent? And going back and spending more time in the teaching phase if you need to, if they're not doing it right. So really taking on that perspective of, it's not that your child can and cannot do it, it's how did we teach them, reinforce, set them up for success. So I loved when she talked about that.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer on, the student or your kid is not wrong. It's the teacher needs to change so how they're teaching it. So, the teacher being us as the parent.
And
So
I think
then
that's an important part too. It's like if you're trying something, it's not working, change your methodology, change your procedures on how you're trying to teach a new skill. Take your time, enjoy the process. Because we have, children at different stages. Monica, like she said, she has a first grader a second grader and a fourth grader, and I have a seventh grader, a ninth grader, and an 11th grader. And I look back and I'm like, oh, they were so little, and it was so much fun. I mean, it was a lot of work, but still, time passes quickly. So enjoy the time. And everybody says this with children that have already moved out. The time goes by quick. Enjoy the stage that you're in, and take your time with it. So it should be an enjoyable process. But again, if you're going to work on a new skill, do it when you have time, when you're not tired, and when you're not in a hurry to do something.
All right, the next phase that I wanted to talk a little bit about is directing. And sometimes we're in the teaching phase and then we start morphing into the directing phase. So I wanted to kind of ask, how do you know when you're starting to transition, and what is the directing phase?
Sure, great question. So, like you said earlier, we're not going from one phase to the next, and it's just very clear in black and white. But the idea is that you're going to continue to be in the teaching phase as you transition more into the directing phase. And so we call it the directing phase because you're more of a director now. Even though you're still a teacher and you're teaching new skills, the skills that have been acquired, the skills that they have, now you're setting the rules and the boundaries, and you're guiding them on what they can or can't do. So that's why we say, for example, you're directing them that they can do this, or you can't do that, or these are the rules, these are the boundaries. So, and that's happening through all the other phases up until they're independent or financially independent, and they're no longer living with you. I mean, you're going to have the rules and the boundaries throughout, as long as they're hopefully under your roof, and you're making sure that they follow those rules and they stay within the boundaries.
And I think during this time, I think about what the child's needs are, they're trying to hone in on their skills like they've already acquired, but they have to start using them in different situations and applying them in different locations with
Mm-hmm.
different people. And then also they're starting to get that really more exploring and independence, at least with some of the skills. So that's why you're kind of sometimes in this teaching phase with some skills and directing phase with other skills.
Yeah, I agree.
I think we also talked about when they have the ability to sort of identify they are doing something right or doing something wrong, and are able to kind of say, I need help, and have a little bit of problem solving skills. It's also a sign that they're ready for a little bit more directing, and just kind of explaining how things go, because they're initiating for a little bit of help as well.
And in terms of like the roles and responsibilities for the parents in this phase, I think about it a lot as giving feedback after they've done things. So it's not so much prompting the skill or teaching the specific thing. It's the child's engaging in that skill, and then you're providing the support after the feedback. And a lot of times it's not necessarily right away either. It might be delayed, because at this point kids are off at preschool or elementary school or middle school, so they're not always with you anymore, and so you're sometimes providing that feedback delayed, and so you're directing them, which is kind of the whole reason for the phase, directing and what was right, what was wrong, what they could do different, and helping them analyze that too.
And it's something that we have to be aware of as a parent while we're in this. We're starting to transition from phase one to phase two, or teaching to directing. Is you have to be very aware, and you want to be able to identify what skills are acquired and what are not. And so is somebody is your son or daughter not doing something because they don't have the skill, or because it's a compliance issue, right? And if it's a compliance issue, then you handle it differently. You're more of a director, and you're talking about the rules, but you also want to be aware that if they're not doing something that's asked of them, is it a skill issue or is it a compliance issue? And if it's a skill issue, you have to jump back in the role of a teacher, and you have to
Mhm.
work with them. And if it's a compliance issue, then you jump back to the role of a director, and you make sure that the rules and the boundaries are clear to everyone involved, so that there's an understanding of what the expectations are.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer, because I was going to ask you guys what happens if in the directing phase they also don't do it right, like, or they made a mistake. Like, what are you going to do as parents?
Well, and I think just having that idea that you're not just in one phase or the other. For some skill sets, you're in the directing phase, and then other ones whether you thought you moved out of the teaching phase or maybe you never taught it. Either way, you're still in that phase. And I think one thing that I've kind of learned that has to go along with more of the directing and also the next phase, which is coaching, which we'll talk about next, is when you do give feedback and talk to your children about the things that they're doing wrong or right, I think asking questions to them is a really important thing that I'm working on, because I'm very quick to tell them what was wrong or right. But trying to get them during this phase, even starting now, to analyze it themselves and ask them, what do you think was good? What do you think we could have done differently, versus just telling them, because that's going to help them in the future as they grow in their independence to analyze these things for themselves.
hmm There was also just a note about, like, in the directing phase, it's really important that these rules and expectations and explanations are happening before the behavior occurs, and not always after as feedback, but that
Right.
you're providing the instructions and the rules so that you're setting them up for success when they go and have the opportunity to engage in that behavior and do that activity.
I was kind of thinking of like how to explain some of the differences too between directing and teaching is, and I think Stephanie might have talked a little bit about this, but with the walking to school example, Marquis. So in the teaching phase, she was walking directly with, like showing him the road, which way to go, all of these things. And then once you're at the directing phase, you're giving the rules, right? But they're starting to engage in the behavior on their own, like making sure, you cross the crosswalk and all of those things that you've taught them how to do, and now they're doing it on their own. Thank you for joining us on this episode of PLP and talking about our first two phases, which is teaching and directing. Stay tuned for part 2, which will go into the next phases. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.